Okay, anyway, the series is Back to the Future, and as I'm sure you're tired of hearing at this point, but thank goodness it's the last time that I have to tell you this. Back to the Future, the idea of it for me came from us all coming back to our old ways, us all coming back from summer, back from vacations, back from all of those things and getting back into all of those older, boring, monotonous ways that just drive us crazy week in and week out. Filing papers, writing papers, getting back to work and school and all of the things that we're supposed to be getting back into. I wanted to take the chance for us to get back into our own personal callings as we're doing that. So that's what this whole thing is about. And each week what we've done is we've focused on an individual person from Scripture as a clue for how we can get back to what it is that God called us to in the first place. Or what it is that God may be calling us to from here on out. So the first Sunday, and I'm putting this in the right order now finally, so less confusion now. The first Sunday was the prequel, which is why this is part 5. We actually had a prequel, and then it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that was Peter. Peter was our example. And he was called to follow. And the idea is that we stand in that place, and with Peter, he was standing in that boat saying, Jesus, call me to follow you. And that's us standing there saying, I see your calling, I understand your calling, how do I follow you? So it's the first moment in which we are called. From that point we go on to Moses. It was part 1, Moses and Joshua. And it was called to fill big shoes. And the idea of that was that we're called to follow God. That God is the one calling us, and that this thing that we're being called to do, this person that we're being called to be, whatever it is that our calling is going to feel overwhelming, and it's going to feel big, and it all centers on God. So we've been called, and we've been called by God. And the next step is us trying to deal with that ourselves. So in part 2, we were called, and we looked at Joseph. We were called to dreams. We were called to great big dreams of amazing things that we could never have imagined for ourselves. And these are things that God gave us for His purpose and His will, to be able to get out there and to be able to do. With Moses, it was this, and with Joshua, it was this huge thing that we could never live up to. But with Joseph, it's this big thing that is exciting, and it's personal, and it's ours. And it's all about the self. And then the next week is part 3, Mary and Joseph. This is where we have to deal with the friends and the family part, because we don't just do it on our own. There are other people in our lives that are going to go with us, that are going to help us through this, that are going to be a part of this. And this was the week where it was going to be called to love. But it was actually called to love. And in a broken and shattered world all around us, how to pick up those pieces and how to figure out how to keep these relationships together, how to bring these relationships back together so that we can go on and make something even more beautiful. So this is the part where everybody comes with us. Part 4 was all about Jonah. Jonah showed us that we are called to run. And Jonah gave us the great example of the fight or the flight. That sure, we've looked at this and we've been called, and it's huge and it's scary. But it's also exciting, and there are big things involved, and there are people that are going to come with us throughout. And now we have to decide, are we going to do it, or are we not going to do it? Are we going to run to the ends of the earth to escape from God Himself, or are we going to embrace it and go along with it? Are we going to run straight into what we've been called to do in the first place? So Jonah showed us how to run. He showed us the wrong way, but we can learn from him still the right way. This week is the last week, and it brings us to Jacob. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 25. Because Jacob, after all of that, after last week especially after part 4, especially of resisting God's call, running away from God's call, this week, after all of that, after evaluating everything, this is the week where we finally learn how to embrace God's calling. And if you remember the story of Jacob very well, you may be wondering in your mind, how are you talking about Jacob and embracing God's calling at the same time? Because when we think about Jacob, we think of, I'm going to switch that around. When we think about calling, we think about fun and happy things, don't we? We think about, we're going to go do the things that we want to do. We take those tests that show us what our personality styles are, and that's what we're called to do. We take those evaluations that say, you would be a good nursery worker. Well, okay, I like working in the nursery. Let's go do it. And we don't ever take that moment to say, maybe we have to push ourselves into something a little bit different. Maybe it's not just about what we want or what we're good at. Maybe it's about something else just a little bit. And Jacob is going to give us a few of those keys, actually. Before we get too far into Jacob, as long as you're at Genesis chapter 25, I'm going to take a side note to step into Jacob through. There are three types of conflict. The authors, screenwriters, all kinds of people who write things and create things like to talk about. Man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus other. And these are the three major things. They've added one lately, apparently man versus society, but that doesn't make any sense because that's just an extension of man versus man to me. But I'm going to add one, man versus spirit, because these leave out the whole other side, the whole spiritual, supernatural realm of things that we do struggle with as Christians. But man versus man is the idea that the Bears hate the Packers. And I can't like Mike that well. I like him, but he's a Packers fan, and I don't know about that guy. It's the idea that has nations fighting against nations. It's rivalries. It's men against men that causes war, that causes competition, that causes all kinds of terrible things to happen. Man versus nature is hurricanes, earthquakes, all these terrible things that happen in our lives. This comes along and it shatters us, and it's something from outside that nature has to do with, and we have to figure out how to overcome that. And then there's man versus self, and we all know that struggle, don't we? That struggle to have to get up out of bed in the mornings, no matter how much you want to keep on sleeping. Sometimes it feels like it's man versus alarm clock in the mornings instead of man versus self. It's that struggle to be a better person. It's that struggle that you always feel, self versus self. Who am I really? How am I going to get through this? And then, as Jacob is going to show us, especially later on, there's man versus spirit. And that's what Paul talks about our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. That there's this whole other realm that exists, that is part of this conflict as well. That all of these other things, yes, we're fighting against, but there's this spiritual side that we're also fighting and battling against. So these are the four types of conflict, the four major categories of conflict that we're going to get into. And with Jacob, he's a great example of this. So we're going to start at verse 19 in chapter 25. And I'm reading out of the New Revised Standard, like a good Wesleyan should. Starting at verse 19, these are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel of the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Now we get into the good stuff. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. The Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. So we see again barrenness. This is they're actually in the same place from earlier times with Abraham and Sarah having their troubles with conceiving children. And here we see kind of it's all happening all over again. But we rush right on through it, and Rebekah conceives. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If this is to be, then why do I live?" And I'm going to pause right there because there's something pretty incredible going on. The children struggling within her. It's crushing. It's fighting. When Sarah was pregnant with Catherine, we played music. We put the headphones on the belly, you know, all that cute thing that you're supposed to do. And Catherine danced, and you got to see her pushing through the belly, and it was fun and everything. When Sarah was pregnant with Rachel, we tried the same thing. It was going to be cute and fun, and we're going to play some music. And Rachel went nuts. And Sarah's over there like, jeeba. So we didn't play nearly as much music with Rachel. Sunday mornings were difficult because Rachel would hear the worship music as we were in church, and she would go nuts. And nothing's ever changed since, obviously, for anybody that knows Rachel. But this is what this is what this Rachel is experiencing in this case. It's not just this fun reaction. It's not that there's this rave going on in your belly because a child likes music. It's that they're literally fighting and clawing and crushing against one another. And she has to deal with this happening inside of her. And what she says is even an incomplete sentence because she can't get it out all the way. What she says is, if this is happening, then why am I? And that's what she's left with. In the New American Standard, it even highlights the "do I live?" Because we try to finish that sentence for her. And anybody who's ever experienced pain or struggle to get through that one thing knows that you're not going to be able to finish that sentence, but everybody knows somehow what you're saying. So Rachel, with all this going on inside of her, went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. This is one of the first examples of the greatest shall be last. This is an example of what's going to happen from this point on in time. That suddenly the underdog is the overdog. First is last, up is down, east is west. In God's world, everything is a little bit different than it's supposed to be, than we want it to be. We want everybody to follow the rules the way they're supposed to follow the rules because those are the rules, people. And yet Jesus comes along and says, love and grace and forgiveness, and wipes the slate clean. And he says we're all going to be on equal footing once we get to that point. And even though the prodigal son is coming back and being forgiven and being given all these things, the older son is on the outside saying, but don't you see that he forsook you? You have been forsaken by him. Whatever the proper pronunciation is of that. And we're seeing it right here for the very first time. The elder shall serve the younger. So in verse 24, when her time to give birth was at hand, they were twins in her womb. The first one came out red, his body all hairy like a mantle. So they named him Esau. His nickname was Edom. These are hairy and these are red. So it's all about who he is. He's ruddy in appearance. He's rugged. He's John the Baptist out in the wilderness. He's that creepy dude on the corner that just, I don't know about him. All those tattoos, and he's dirty, and he's smelly, and Afterward, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. What's happening here is they were fighting in this womb. They were crushing each other from within Rachel. And now as they're coming out, Jacob is still fighting. He won't let it go. He's trying to grab and pull him back in so that Jacob can get out first. They're still fighting the entire time. So he was named Jacob. And this is all about supplanting. This is all about grabbing the heel and trying to do exactly what he was trying to do. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore him. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. There are favorites in this family. There are two sides. There's the Hatfields and the McCoys. There's Isaac and Esau on the one side, and there's Rebekah and Jacob on the other. And that's just how it is. So we see from birth, from before birth, Jacob is fighting with Esau. Jacob comes out of the womb fighting and struggling and grabbing a hold of whatever he can to come out on top in one way or another. And there's conflict from within, right off the bat. Now we're going to skip on down over to chapter 27. There's a conflict that keeps on happening there, and what happens in between, well, what happens there in chapter 26 and 25 is that Jacob tricks Esau into giving up his birthright. Now there's a difference between the birthright and what we're going to talk about here, that is the blessing. The birthright of the oldest son is double the inheritance of the younger son. It's an inheritance. It's a physical and actual, these are the things that you get as a birthright. So in this moment of pure treachery, Jacob steals this away, tricks Esau out of it. And in chapter 27, we're going to see kind of more of the same happening. Starting at verse 1 in chapter 27. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "See, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food such as I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die." What's happening here is, like I said, the birthright is all about the inheritance. It's the physical stuff. When he passes away, these are my things and those are your things. The blessing here is something else. It's something much more powerful. And it's not what we think of #blessed these days. It's not just we're having a good life and he said some nice things and I feel good about this. And the language of it is even indicative of what this is. What he says here is not simply that I may bless you, it's that my soul may bless you before I die. My innermost, all of my being. I'm going to eat this food that you gave me, and through everything I'm going to pour out this supernatural blessing upon you. And it's this prophecy, it's this thing that's going to happen that's going to determine the rest of your life. So the birthright is on one side and the blessing is on the other side. And Esau, having already given up double his inheritance, is hoping to still come away with an amazing prophecy, an amazing future for his life. And we're going to skip on down to verse 24. We can get right into the good stuff. Isaac is there in the tent, not being able to see very well. Jacob is coming to him. Rebekah has helped him dress up and fool the old man. And they're going to do something also, again, truly treacherous. And by this point, Jacob has even gone so far as to blatantly lie in this situation. It's not just a prank. It's not just a trick. He's gone out and he's been deceiving and lying, and it's terrible. So in verse 24, Isaac said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered him, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it to me, the food, that I may eat some of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it to him and he ate, and he brought him wine and he drank. Then Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near me and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him, and said, "Ah, the smell of my son. It is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." See, they would have had two different smells. Jacob would have been in the fields with the sheep, and he would have stunk so bad, it would have been gross. And Esau would have had the smell of the forest and the wild flowers, because he would have been out hunting and doing those sorts of things. So ironically enough, Jacob would have smelled bad and Esau would have smelled good. It's like the field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. What an amazing blessing. He covered all the bases with this blessing. Because you see right off the bat, man versus nature. When you come into contact with that conflict, this blessing covers that. He gives you the dew of heaven, the fatness of earth, plenty of grain and wine. The nature is going to be in your favor. You're going to have an abundance. You win the man versus nature battle. In the next one, it's let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Man versus man. Be Lord over your brothers. May your mother's sons bow down to you. You win. Man versus man, you're going to rise above all of that. My blessing will cover it. That's another one you win. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. This gets into the spiritual side of things. All of that spiritual side of things that's going to happen to you, these supernatural things that are going to happen, you're going to win, because my blessing is going to cover you. And he thinks he's blessing Esau, and he winds up blessing Jacob. The younger son, the deceiver, the heel grabber, the supplanter, comes along and he steals the blessing away. He gets double the stuff, and now he gets to win all of the conflicts. Man versus man, nature and spirit. And of course, he's going to have to figure out how to beat himself. And we're going to see in verse 30 what happens from this. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father Isaac, in other words, Jacob's leaving one side of the tent and Esau is coming in the other side. His brother Esau came in from his hunting. He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father sit up and eat some of his son's game, so that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I'm your firstborn son, Esau." Then Isaac trembled violently. He's so angry that he's been tricked. He knew this was coming. And he said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came. And I blessed him. Yes, and blessed shall he be. I can't take that back. It was this amazing thing. It took all of me and I poured it out on him, and I have nothing left to give." When Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me, me also, my father." But he said to him, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." Esau said, "Is it not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright. And look, now he has taken away my blessing." Then he answered, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" So Jacob steals this away from Esau. And once again, Esau loses this game, loses this battle. Jacob comes out from the womb trying to fight. And once they come out, Jacob just wins. He fights and he struggles and he does everything he can, and he keeps on winning. Now, an amazing thing happens in the commentaries. There's this battle that happens as people commentate over this section. And they're trying to justify Jacob's actions. Or they're trying to come up with reasons for some of these things. And saying, maybe Jacob wasn't actually lying when he did this. Maybe, we could be reading this wrong and we can change the verbiage. And ultimately what happens is Jacob is being a trickster. He's being a deceiver, and he's taking something for himself. And then they look at it and they say, well, maybe this is simply what God had in mind in the first place. I mean, when he talked to Rachel about the two nations, he said the younger was going to be the older. So ultimately, God was saying that this was going to happen. And who is following God? Is Isaac the father following God by trying to give the blessing to Esau? Or is he actually trying to go around God by giving the blessing to Esau? Because they knew this prophecy. They knew that it was supposed to be the younger rising up and taking all of these things over the older. So which one was doing the right thing in these circumstances? Was it Isaac who was trying to go around God to give Esau the blessing? Or was it Rebekah who was going around Isaac to give Jacob the blessing? I don't know. And these commentaries don't seem to know. They're all over the place with this. But it sure is fun to argue about. And ultimately what happens here is there's a fight. There's a conflict going on throughout this entire time. And it's man versus man, and man versus nature, and man versus self, and man versus spirit. And there's just fighting in the darkness, and fists, and everything's happening. And who knows what's right and what's wrong? Because God said what was going to happen. God put his blessing over this, and he said, it's not going to be like it ever was before. And we see that it's not like it ever was before. And that it's going to change from here on out. We're going to skip ahead to chapter 29. And we're going to see that the trickster who's won all of these things is going to wind up with an uncle who knows all of these tricks. In chapter 29, verse 16, now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, which unfortunately enough is translated cow. The name of the younger was Rachel, which is sheep, or lamb of God. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Verse 17 is one of those sections again where everybody comes up with their own way of understanding it. I like this version because it helped me remember to talk about one commentator that said, this may simply be the equivalent of saying, Leah, you know, she had a nice personality. She was cool. She was okay. Nobody really disliked Leah. Her name may mean cow, but that doesn't mean she was, you know, the hag that we make her into being sometimes. And Rachel, of course, is this otherworldly beauty and grace and full of these wonderful things. And the difference in the eyes is that one seems to gleam and glow and the other seems a bit duller, perhaps. But whatever it is, Jacob loved Rachel. Verse 18, Jacob loved Rachel. So he tells Laban, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man, so stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, but they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. How romantic. What a beautiful thing. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. And suddenly the romance is gone, because I don't know how your translations go, but this is euphemism. He's waited his 7 years and he wants what he wants. Yeah, I'm not going to do it, don't worry. There are children present. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast, and it was beautiful and it was wonderful. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Euphemism. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. What just happened? He loves Rachel. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn." Laban tricks Jacob. All of that stuff comes right back to him. And suddenly Jacob, in this man versus man, loses this battle. And now he winds up with the sister that he didn't want to marry in the first place. And this beautiful romantic situation is just all upheaved, and who knows what's going to happen. Once again, is this God working? Because Leah goes on to birth so many tribes of Israel. And Zilpah is a part of that. And Rachel winds up only having 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And her handmaid has a few more. But over half of them come from the Zilpah-Leah side of things. Is this God's provision, or is this God blessing something that happened as it was in the first place? I don't like answering questions like that. I like leaving things uncomfortable and difficult. And that's because that's what this whole sermon is all about. That's what this whole thing is all about. That's what Jacob is all about showing us. It's a fight, it's a battle, it's a struggle, it's a conflict. We have to wrestle with this and try to understand it. And there are not simply easy answers to anything in our relationship with God. There are some easy answers. Jesus loves you. That's an easy answer. Everybody can relate to that. Grace covers all. Forgiveness is there for everybody. But as we go deeper and as we get into these things, we see that it's not always just, pray the prayer and things are going to be wonderful from there on out. Sometimes there's a lot more involved. There's still life that's happening. There's still conflict that's happening. So in verse 27, Laban's still talking to Jacob. And he actually rebukes him by saying, "This is not done in our country. I had to marry the older one to you. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." He slips this in. Laban, the used car salesman, grabs Jacob and he wins. And he says, "I'm going to turn this 7 into 14, and you get both of my daughters, and they're going to be well taken care of. But I get solid 14 years out of this kid." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went in to Rachel also. And he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. And like I said, Laban wins this battle. Jacob and Laban are going at it, and Laban comes out on top this time. But it's an amazing situation that we wind up with sisters that are in the same situation as the brothers. That we have the younger coming out above the older. That we have Jacob loving Rachel more than Leah. Just like Rebekah loved Jacob more than Esau. Or Isaac loved Esau more than Jacob. I got it right that time. And in this situation, again, like I said, more and more and more conflict. So what does this all mean for us? All of this means that we're going to finish with chapter 32, with the big showdown that I expected so much more material out of, and was disappointed to find only commentaries. Chapter 32, starting at verse 22. This is the point at which Jacob is coming back to his homeland. Jacob knows that he has hurt Esau, that Esau is going to kill Jacob because he hates him so much, because he stole so much. And Jacob has set up this elaborate scheme because he's Jacob, for Pete's sake. And he puts all of these things, these gifts in front of him to hopefully wear Esau out and maybe make him feel better and soften him up and just, get him to the point where he just can't kill Jacob by the time he finally sees him. So he puts all of his possessions in front of him. He even puts his family out in front of him. Jacob. So starting at verse 22, that same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And what's going to happen in this microcosm is we're going to see everything that happens in Jacob's life in this one small moment in time. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket. In many translations, it's more accurate to say that he touched him on the hip socket. It wasn't even a hit, it was just a poke or a touch. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. He's still wrestling with him. Jacob fighting constantly everywhere. Then he said, "Let me go, for day is breaking. This man, this stranger, who knows who he is?" But Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And we see all of these scenes all over again. He's coming out of the womb, grabbing Esau's heel. He's fighting and he's tricking and he's doing all of these things. And Jacob's just grabbing a hold and grasping a hold and doing everything he can to take and to get whatever he can. And we see him looking for this blessing once again, more and more and more. So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name? You know who I am." That's implied. And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, and he was limping because of his hip. And we're going to stop there. In the middle of the night, on the verge of a horrible conflict that's surely going to mean Jacob's death, he finds himself wrestling with a stranger. It happens so suddenly that we're in the middle of the fight before we realize what's happening as we read it. And Jacob doesn't even know who he's fighting with until we get to the end of all things. And suddenly he's no longer Jacob. Suddenly he's Israel. And it doesn't necessarily make it any better because Jacob was the trickster. Jacob grabbed the heel. He's always fighting. He's doing everything he can. And Israel is to struggle with God, to fight with God, to fight with men, to fight with all of those around. And that this is the conflict that is within Jacob. It's just who he is somehow as Israel goes forward. And it's not just a name for this individual person, it's a name that becomes a name for an entire nation. And it's not just a name for an entire nation, it's this name that becomes something of an identity for all who follow God. And I don't know about you, but the first time that I read Jacob, I did not like that guy. He was a jerk. And he did everything the wrong way, Jacob. Don't you know there's a right way to do things? And here you are tricking people and lying to people. And why does God keep working with you? Because that's not how you're supposed to do things. And it took me a long time to realize that as Jacob, sure, he was doing all the wrong things. But as Israel, it gives us a clue into why and what was going on. See, we've gone through all these phases of the personal calling. We've gone through seeing the calling and for trying to understand the calling. We've gone through ourselves, we've gone through God, we've gone through others. We've even gone through what's going to happen when we run away from it. And here we see that no matter what happens in our lives, we will identify with Israel We will identify with Jacob, and we need to, because we've got to grab a hold of that calling. We've got to wrestle with that calling, and we've got to keep a hold of it no matter what. Jacob wanted to know, with these blessings, he wanted to fight and to struggle and to take everything he could, because he needed to find his identity. He needed to see what he was meant for. And isn't that what we're looking for when we try to understand what our calling is? Aren't we trying to grab a better understanding of ourselves, a better understanding of the world around us, and a better understanding of who we are with God and with others? Man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self, and man versus spirit. It's all right there in our own personal calling. And it's not just going to get handed over to us. It's not just, I'm going to go into youth ministry because I'm good with kids and I like it and it's fun. It's going to turn into something else on you. And Mike's going to wind up as a math teacher out of it. And we're going to find out that these fights and these wrestlings are things that we are being called to do. We're being called to wrestle with God, to wrestle with each other, to fight and to conflict. And these are things that I am not good at. I do not like conflict. I like saying, whatever you want, let's do, let's go. I like it. And yet I've got to go out there and I've got to push and I've got to struggle and I've got to fight, because you know what? God can take it. And seriously, have you ever read the book of Psalms? Because most of Psalms is David fighting and being angry with God. Have you ever read the rest of Scripture? Jesus is in the garden saying, I don't want this. He's sweating blood for Pete's sake. This is a fight. This is a struggle. This is a battle. These are things that we want and we've got to understand, and I don't get it, but somehow this works. And I just want to follow you, God. I just want my calling. I just want to be called. And I want to know what I'm being called for. And ultimately, once all is done and said, we're called to embrace this calling. And it's going to change on us down the road. And we're going to have to keep a hold of it as it goes. And we're going to have to wrestle it down and say, no, you are going to stick with me because God has given you to me. We're going to fight with others in our lives because they're just not going to be doing what we want them to do. And we're going to come out with an equilibrium because sometimes we are wrong. And sometimes they're wrong. We're going to fight with ourselves every single day because I'm not living up to that calling. And I don't understand that calling. And maybe I'm doing the wrong thing once again. But ultimately, Jacob fights with God. And he comes out winning. Not because God lost. Not because God lost. But because he made it for Jacob to win. And that's what's going to happen for us. We're going to come out on top. We're not going to beat God. We're not going to beat each other. It's not about who wins, because everybody wins. It's not about who loses, because everybody wins. It's about struggling with it every day of our lives. And just like we talked about some of us, I suppose, talked about last week, that one of these times it's just going to get easier and it's just going to get better, right? Well, no. It's always going to be a struggle. It's always going to be a conflict. And that's the fun of it. And there will be days where we can take a break and we can breathe a little bit. But ultimately, don't ever give up on that fight. Don't ever give up on that conflict. Keep pushing and struggling and trying to grab it and bring it down. Because God is calling us to wrestle just like he called Israel to wrestle with him. Let's pray.